How many of you are basketball fans? How many of you watched any of the NCAA tourney? Next year, the Cyclones will be there, don't you think? Anyway, how many of you saw the father-son who, in the aftermath of the victory, did their little dance on the camera? Any of you see that little dance that went viral? Just a celebration that they did, and they ended up getting on camera. You can go home and Google it if you want and see their dance, but they were happy, and the song was happy. But I wonder if when Jesus entered into Jerusalem's gates, if it was like being in a gymnasium, you know, when they're having a pep rally for the team to fire them up before the big game. So there's lots of cheering, and there's lots of people really excited and pumped up. Everybody's yelling, and Jesus rides in on the donkey, and the disciples are in tow. People are waving their branches like we were as the children were coming around the bend this morning, laying their clothes down in front to make his way soft. I want to be a part of the parade, don't you? Don't you want to be there? Don't you want to see that? But we know that within a few days, Pilate made sure that the sign above the executed one, which, by the way, the sign always stated above the crucified, the charge against them. The sign above the head of Jesus said, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews," written in 3 languages so everybody'd be able to read it as they came through the gates of Jerusalem. Whole different scene, wouldn't you say? Isn't it true that when a play starts on Broadway and the critics review it, the question is it any good? Were the actors any good? Did you like it? How about the plot? Or you go see a new movie and people say, "How was the movie? Did you enjoy it?" Isn't that what we do? Don't we review things and make opinions about what we see and judge whether it's good or not? Some of you are going to walk out of here and say, "I didn't like the preacher at all this morning," right? You get a new superintendent of schools, you get a new president, you get a new coach for the team, and there's always people who are drawing conclusions in review of whether that person is good or not, whether they like their mannerisms, how they speak. But when Jesus comes through the gates, they are singing the praise, "You are our King, Hosanna," which means save us. Hosanna, blessed is God who sent us this King. Psalm 48 says it this way, "Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, in the mountains of holiness, beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth in the city of our great King." Jesus owned the city. He came in, and everybody, eventually, even those in different outer circles, who initially said, "What's going on? Who is this? What is this?" eventually knew the assertion that the King of the Jews had entered the city. But before the week was over, again, just like the sign over the cross, we know that the response was mixed reviews. So I wonder if you in faith have ever had expectations of God, and if those expectations were always to the zenith, or whether there were moments where honestly you were disappointed or disenfranchised by how life unfolded as you thought God would do something on your behalf. So I wonder if for a few minutes if we could just move through the characters in the Passion story and see what their response was from Palm Sunday to Good Friday and on. Caiaphas was the high priest of the Jews, the ruler of the Sanhedrin. Caiaphas, from the day Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, wanted Jesus dead. The interesting thing is that Caiaphas and God agreed upon this truth, which Caiaphas said immediately after Lazarus was raised. He said, "Better that one person would die than that the whole nation would perish. God agreed. That's why he sent Jesus. Better that my son would die than that the whole world would perish. What Caiaphas meant was the opposite. He saw the teachings of Jesus ushering in a kingdom of love, not a kingdom based on law or the power of Caiaphas and his cronies, as dangerous. And amazingly, after Jesus showed the power to raise Lazarus from the dead, instead of Caiaphas being persuaded, hey, this guy is something special, instead, all Caiaphas could think was, Lazarus is a living witness to the power of this prophet from Nazareth named Jesus. We gotta kill him. We gotta kill him. Judas was well-intended, I would argue. Well-intended because all the expectations of the Jews through the centuries for the Messiah was that when the king came, this Messiah was going to lift up God's people to rule the world, defeat all their enemies, usher in an age of peace, give to everybody a prosperous, good life where life was easy. And so Judas all along had seen the powerful things that Jesus had done. And he thought, this is our guy. We can go with him to the power that will enable us to rule the world. I want that life becomes easy for me. And I want that Israel is the dominant force in the world. But then, Jesus was humble. He was not flexing his political muscle. He was instead talking about a spiritual kingdom. And Judas said, wait a minute. And we also know that Judas, who was the keeper of the treasury, struggled with greed. So he advocated a lot of times, Jesus, don't waste that money. Why? Because the money that came in for Jesus, Judas kept the money. You think he was slipping a little into his own pocket on the side? Maybe. But we know that he sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. Some have wondered, did Judas think because he knew how Jesus was powerful, that in so doing he was going to force Jesus to overthrow the Romans? Or was it just plain greed? And Judas truly lost his soul in the process. But either way, the response from Palm Sunday and forward were vastly different. People have said that I'm a little impulsive, a little loudmouth, sometimes obnoxious. That's why I love Peter. Peter, well-intended all along, meant it when he said, Lord, I will never deny you, I will die for you, but I will be faithful to you. But we know how that story ended too, don't we? When Peter, at the rest of Jesus, took out his small saber sword and cut off the ear, Jesus said, that's not how it's going down, Peter. And I think Peter, when he couldn't do it his way, didn't know what he was supposed to do. We know that Peter was so arrogant that he would even take King Jesus aside and try and straighten him out. Like when Jesus first told the disciples, hey, I'm going to Jerusalem, they're going to kill me. And Peter took him aside and said, that can't be you, Jesus. But eventually Peter shows the weakness of his humanity when a little servant girl at the fireside outside Jesus' trial says, hey, you speak with a Galilean accent. You're with Jesus too, aren't you? And he cursed and he swore and he disassociated himself altogether with Jesus. But here's the truth as we work our way through these characters, that at different points in each of our journey, we can say, that was me today. I can identify with that. I was just like that person in how I acted today. What Jesus needed from Peter and his disciples and all of us was not that we would pick up the sword necessarily, but that we will be faithful to him as our King. Would you say your heart is loyal? Would you say, Jesus, you are my King, and I wish in all my heart to be faithful to you every day? For little Chase and little Kinley, who were brought to the Lord in baptism, don't we pray that they would grow up and resonate with the faith of their parents, and that they also would embrace that faith to be faithful to Jesus? Pilate wanted nothing to do with Jesus. Pilate's wife said, hey, don't mess with that man. Pilate kept telling this angry crowd, I find no guilt in him. He's done nothing wrong. He does not deserve to die. But the mob kept yelling for Jesus' head. So Pilate went to a wash basin. He who had all power to implement justice went to a wash basin to wash his hands as if he's not responsible for turning an innocent man over to the will of the mob. Of course, it doesn't work that way, right? Isn't Pilate responsible for what he's done in advocating or in abdicating justice and letting Jesus be crucified? The soldiers say all the right things, but mean none of them. They did not believe he was king of the Jews, but they put a purple robe across his shoulders. They blindfolded him and said, hey, you're supposed to be able to prophesy. And then they smacked him with closed fists or with open hands and spit in his face and said, okay, prophet, tell me who hit you. And then as King Dan told the children, they pressed a crown of thorns on his head and feigned mockery. Hail, King of the Jews. And there are people who say all the right things about the identity of Jesus, but mean none of them. The crowd is not unlike Judas. They also had all these expectations of what would happen when the king comes, but when they find out that he's not going to seize power, throw out Herod, or defy Rome, they want to kill him too. Is it possible that you and I also, like the crowd, look sideways to figure out what we should believe? Is it possible that we kind of wet our finger and put it to the wind to see what we ought to do, instead of owning the truth of what we embrace about who Jesus is as the Son of God? So now the king doesn't have much support left. All the disciples have deserted him. He didn't get a fair trial. Pilate turned him over to an angry mob. No one is standing with him. But here's what you and I need to realize. God would be God though all men be dead. Our response to Jesus does not change his identity. And even if you live your journey as if God does not exist, Jesus still went to the cross for rebels like you and me. Even if you have no faith, the Son of God still hung on the cross and said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. We can spit in his face. We can beat him with our fists. We can mock him. We can run away from him. We can be like Peter and deny him. And Jesus is still the Son of God. All hail King Jesus. You see, now there's one more person for us to talk about in the parade and the days that follow. And that's you and me. So what do we say? How will we respond? And it's true to say that there is no more significant response in your and my life than to answer Pilate's question to the crowd, which is, what should I do with Jesus? Everybody has to answer that question. What do I do with Jesus? And not to decide is to decide. The King comes to the gate, but Savior, hail, Jesus.